I think our book is essentially about dealing with the puzzle of how do we engage and try to prevent and manage violent extremism. I think we've seen that in the past, very often when the international community tried to support local communities to prevent and manage violent extremism, that those initiatives were unsuccessful or in some cases even made the situation worse. So we are struggling with that and trying to understand why is that the case and what can we do different. And so in the book, I think we focus on shifting our work from dealing with symptoms to dealing rather with the grievances and causes of the conflict. And that means we shift away from a kind of a hard security approach to dealing with the insecurity, to rather focusing on how can we help communities to build resilience, strengthen their social cohesion, so that we address the grievances that are underlying violent extremism, rather than dealing with the symptoms of violent or the consequences of violent extremism. So our book is looking at different cases, Syria, Iraq, the Sahel, Mozambique, and from those cases we are trying to understand how in the experience of those cases, dealing with the symptoms or dealing with the underlying causes, what the different effects are that those attempts produce. We cover specific case studies, some from Africa, some from the Middle East, some from Asia. And we cover a number of thematic areas. We look at the relationship between climate change, conflict and violent extremism. We look at gender. We look at the socioeconomic factors. And we also look at the individual psychological or emotional and reconciliation dimension of violent extremism and dealing with violent extremism. I think firstly we need to understand that when we engage with peace and conflict, it has to be context specific. In other words, it's not something we can import from somewhere else. It's something that needs to come from the situation itself. And secondly, I would say a key lesson is that it needs to be a participatory process. So it's something we do together with the communities. It's not something, peace is not something that experts have knowledge of that they can bring to a community. It has to come from the experience of the community itself. So what peace experts can do at best is be a kind of a process facilitator in that engagement.
So let me make 2 points on this. First, with conducive environment for violent extremism, we understand a society or a community where some sort of the following factors may be present. First of all, a weak and illegitimate state structure. Secondly, insecurity, both physical and human security, understood as access to food, water, livelihood, etc. Third, marginalization and alienation. Fourth, lack of social and geographic mobility. Fifth, right-based grievances. And I could continue, but let me move to my second point. So, violent extremism rarely starts with ideology or religion, although the leaders of such groups often use this instrumentally. It is more about the root causes, such as the ones I just mentioned. And we need to remember that although in the most enabling environments, most people are not radicalized. So this is highly context dependent, clearly, but through studies in an EU-funded research project called PREVEX, we have seen some patterns that seem to be valid across different regions. First of all, the role of local agents of resilience matters. These are actors that are vested with legitimacy, trust, and authority, such as traditional or religious leaders. Second, social cohesion in society matters. The level of horizontal trust is most important, but also to some extent the vertical trust. Third, opportunities for mobility, social and geographical. Fourth, representation, that people feel that they are represented. Fifth, educational and job opportunities. And finally, a sense of security. And it is important to keep in mind that what promotes radicalization and resilience to radicalization often are two sides of the same coin.
This chapter takes the case of ISIS, the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, its emergence and decline during the Syrian conflict, and the international and local responses to it in Syria. ISIS emerged from the governance vacuum created by the violent conflict and expanded the areas under its effective control. This chapter has examined two approaches taken by the international community. One is military intervention by the international community. It was successful in the sense that it was able to defeat ISIS and ISIS lost its territory. However, despite its success against ISIS, the military intervention did not directly address the root cause of the Syrian conflict. The fragmentation of governance in the country continues. The other is a non-military approach, mainly humanitarian assistance. The fight against ISIS in Syria has lasted several years, and as a result, the humanitarian situation in Syria has worsened. Even when the conflict ends, it will take many years and much effort to rebuild the destroyed infrastructure. While social cohesion and peacebuilding are critical to preventing and countering violent extremism, the primary purpose of humanitarian assistance in Syria is to save lives. In a protracted conflict, it is not easy to implement comprehensive peacebuilding assistance. Therefore, assistance that goes beyond life-saving and that can support community-based resilience building based on Syrian-led activities is useful. This chapter has highlighted some resilience building efforts at the community level by the international community and Syrians with high capacity and motivations. The longer the conflict continues, the greater the need for assistance beyond life-saving. Such cooperation by the international community is crucial.
So my chapter is about Iraq and social cohesion, and it explores how peacebuilding informed comprehensive approaches that aim to promote social cohesion can contribute to the resilience of the Iraqi society and prevent it from falling back into violent extremism. So there are many factors. The Iraqi society is highly complex, highly sophisticated. It's fragmented along many lines that often intersect in rather complex ways. So for example, we have ethnic and religious lines, tribal divisions, gender lines, differences between people that live in urban and rural environments, differences in social status, displaced, returning and hosting populations. And moreover, 2 decades of almost continuous conflict have really sharpened these divisions. They have further weakened the already weak Iraqi social fabric and also its institutional setting. So the state is rather fragile in Iraq. So working on strengthening Iraqi social cohesion needs not only work on providing the mechanisms to rebuild trust among the different groups, the different members of society, the different communities that form this society, but also needs addressing the fragility of the institutions and making capable of providing fair and proportional justice, equal opportunities, economic prosperity, education, stable and secure environment, fight against corruption, and so on. So, in short, Iraq needs not only a strong system of governance that's able to create the right conditions for Iraqis of different ethnicities, religious groups, backgrounds, etc., can rebuild their trust and their confidence on one another, but also a more favorable political environment.
Our book chapter is about environmental peace building and prevention of violent extremism, how we can use environmental peace building as a concept to support efforts of preventing violent extremism and build societal resilience. We're starting in the book chapter as a premise that climate change and environmental pressures are contributing to violent extremism. They are undermining people's or affecting people's vulnerability of increasing grievances within society, and as a consequence we see an increase in violent extremism in a lot of cases. So environmental peace building then comes in on the flip side, like how can we use an intervention of around environmental issues, the management of water resources, building climate adaptation efforts. How can we use those to counter some of those grievances, build resilience and support peace efforts?
In my book chapter, I look at patterns of community resilience developed in areas where jihadist groups linked to the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda operate. And I look at, concentrate specifically on what kind of intervention is developed on the ground. So I analyze projects that are carried out by local civil societies and NGOs in the context of preventing and countering violent extremism, especially looking at the gender dimension. Gender here is understood as a broad analytical concept looking at men, women, masculinities and femininities as well. So the aim of the chapter is to assess to what extent are the activities provided effective not only in preventing and combating extremism, but also to build peaceful and resilient communities benefiting both men and women. Well, in a context like Niger, societal and cultural norms play an important role in defining what kind of roles women play both in the context of the insurgency and in the context of preventing and countering violent extremism and building community resilience. So this means that in Niger, a context where the patriarchal system is deeply ingrained within society, traditional norms and also customary norms often are discriminatory towards women and determine the kinds of roles they play in society. So the analysis shows that activities aimed at promoting women's leadership, women's literacy, with an eye to strengthen their capacity and aim at building community resilience in general are quite good in abstract terms to promote women's empowerment. But overall, they show two main limitations. As, for instance, they don't take specifically women's needs into account, women's most pressing needs into account, that is security and making a livelihood. And on the other hand, secondly, they are also not gender transforming enough, which means that they don't tackle patriarchal structures at the very bottom. So in general, Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism project aimed at building resilience should also take these elements into account.
My chapter is about violent extremism in post-war Sri Lanka and specifically looking into how survivors are impacted by the conflict as well as the extremism that happened after the conflict, and then how they deal with it in terms of very local, ground-based local approaches to dealing with the impact of violent extremism, specifically the emotional impact. And then also looking into some of the community-based organizations and the state interventions, and then sort of comparing these different interventions to see what is it that each group can learn from each other. code into my research, one of the things that helps people to prepare for emotion, survivors, civilians, to prepare for violence as well as to deal with the impact of violence is actually emotions. The data literally shows how emotions is a vulnerability, definitely. Going through these traumatic experiences, I have some case studies in the chapter which shows that going through these experiences obviously creates certain psychological scars, which is a vulnerability. But then also these civilians use that same trauma and vulnerability, translate it into resilience by developing empathy to create these sort of very harmonious relationships between conflicting identities, ethnic, religious identities, which is a finding in this research. The community-based organizations that I work with, they also recognize this sort of very complex role that emotions play in preparation for violence as well as dealing with its impact. There are projects I categorize in my chapter to implicit, explicit, and then really show how they target emotions in that sense to create this reconciliation and harmonious relationships in the community. When it comes to state interventions, however, they seem to fail. Somehow the space, to create the space to address emotions as both a resource and a vulnerability, so that helping people to prepare for violence and helping people to deal with the impact of violence in that sense, violent extremism, state interventions can definitely learn from what the community and community-based organizations are teaching. So some of the recommendations that I make in the chapter is literally about that factor, like how can, of course, bilateral, multilateral agencies like JICA as well as state can use these lessons to somehow create a means through which community understandings, community experiences, community resilience can be translated to policy and intervention programs.
My chapter is about to examine the mechanism to foster the resilience to the violent extremism through the religious-based approach rather than the security military-based approach, taking up the case of the community resilience project in Mindanao that was implemented by the Asian Foundation Non-Governmental Development Agency and the civil society organization, local one, and then funded by the Australian government, which has been highly committed to the peace and the stability in the Indo-Pacific region, ultimately address the role of the development agency in the preventing, the countering the violent extremism for the sustainable peace. The approach is characterized by the context-specific and the participatory and adaptive and evidence-based, with the focus of the capacity development in the local government, with the idea that the local government, which are the frontliner in face of the violent extremism, can reduce the vulnerability of their community to any kind of the violence and the conflict through the strengthening the community inclusion and then resilience. The approach can enhance the capacity of the local government to identify the driver of the violent extremism and the vulnerability and the risk by addressing the grievances of the diverse local people, the vulnerables, especially the women, the young, and the religious leader, the minority, and formulating the strategy and an action plan with the diverse stakeholders in security sector, including the Philippine Army, National Police, and the line agencies and the civil society organization, to respond to the vulnerabilities through the effective resource allocation, execution to the vulnerable, that ultimately lead to the reconciliation of the community and the strengthening of social cohesion in divided society due to the protracted conflict and the violence.